Welcome to Unshielded, the podcast where we explore the cutting edge of blockchain, data protection, and the quest for a more equitable and accessible internet. Today, we've got an exciting episode. Every growing blockchain ecosystem has strategic partners that help drive application development and adoption, and Midnight is no exception. We've invited Stasia Carson, co-founder of Sindri, to discuss how they are supporting Midnight developers, the importance of ease of use of dApps utilizing zero-knowledge proofs, and where there's opportunities for ZK in the year ahead. Stasia, welcome to Unshielded. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. For those people who don't know you, could you give us your quick introduction? And for those people who don't know Sindri, what is it that you guys work on specifically?
Yeah, for sure. My name is Stasia Carson. I am co-founder and CEO of Sindri. Sindri is a ZK infrastructure automation company, and we're helping teams deploy with really killer use cases that leverage zero-knowledge technology.
Fabulous. And Sindri recently joined the Midnight Network to support ZK app development for our community, as well as giving feedback to the network during the current testnet phase. Could you discuss a little bit about what's been your experience so far?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, what struck us like very early on in our collaboration with Midnight is how closely your design choices around a very modernized developer experience mirror our own at Sindri. And so I'll give you a quick example. I think Midnight's TypeScript-based approach and then paired with the compact language library is this really brilliant combination, right? It abstracts like very complex concepts like selective disclosure, and it turns them into these like very highly intuitive developer primitives. And all of that with like very much like plugin utility that goes alongside that. So on Sindri's side, we eliminate the need for developers to worry about proof generation and infrastructure. So out of the gates, like this was just like a really good natural synergy and overlap in ethos. And just, I think our vision sort of aligned off the bat. I think the experience for us thus far, at least through testnet, has been pretty exceptional. And architecturally, like the choices that were made by Midnight are really beginning to shine, at least in our view. So categorically, like the enterprise blockchain space has been waiting for a solution that bridges, I'd say, privacy and practicality. And so reiterating sort of the decisions around TypeScript-based development environments, it's things like that allow enterprises to use existing engineering teams to build these really novel applications. And so when you pair that with something like Sindri, I think there's just this natural blend in which existing corporate IT environments and teams that value enterprise packaging have like a really natural solution at hand. So I think anytime, just generally how we look at building at Sindri, anytime you can remove like a layer of complexity or another layer of technical lift, you typically start to see builders converge around that motion. And I'd say that this is particularly critical in enterprise where like these IT departments are already skeptical about new technology. So I think it's pretty clear you guys have been really thoughtful and purposeful around like building an environment where you get the things that you love about blockchain, but you get them sort of like in an enterprise grade setting.
That's a really interesting way of framing it. And I think it's important at this stage in the journey of decentralized technologies, Web3, also the use of emerging technologies like zero knowledge and selective disclosure, that we do make it as easy as possible for existing developers to engage with. We've seen the early adopters in Web3 and builders of decentralized apps. They're the ones who are pioneering. But if we really want mass adoption, if we really want scaled use of these technologies, we've got to meet people where they are and use development frameworks or languages that people are familiar with, not forcing them into more and increasingly complex corners of the development world. So I think we're on the right path. Let's talk about Sindri for a moment now. So for those who are building on Midnight or for those existing dApp developers, what are some of the benefits of leveraging the building and tooling at Sindri?
I'd actually like to go back to something you said, sort of meeting developers where they are, and something that we take to heart here at Sindri very seriously. And so have adapted our solution in order to do so. But backing up a little bit, Sindri, we're a ZK automation company. So we provide an API for some of the fastest growing teams in ZK. And we abstract away the infrastructure, the cloud complexities, all of the things and stuff that stands in between them and the infrastructure that's required to ship their products. So we turn what is otherwise like a very slow, expensive process with these multiple points of failure into very fast and efficient, easy to use API frames. So today we empower something like over 600 developer teams who rely on us to automate DevOps, grow their user bases, and help them focus on building the next killer ZK app. Usually I'm asked like, why do I need a solution like Sindri? And then we can sort of get to the meat of your question. But I think generally speaking, the impression is that generating proofs at scale is this like very relatively easy thing to do. When in reality, it's an incredibly tall task. And it requires expertise across cryptography, deep infrastructure, low-level development. And this is particularly relevant at scale. And that's where enterprises are wanting to run like tens of thousands of proofs per second. And when latency is like a very much like a driving factor in UX. The way that I sort of structure this mental model is imagine like if every time you wanted to deploy a web application, you had to build your own cloud infrastructure from scratch, like manually configuring servers, setting up load balancers, managing scaling policies. Like that's effectively what faces developers that are trying to launch at the infrastructure layer with ZK today. You need to manage like specialized GPU clusters, handle pipelines, orchestration, deal with different configurations. And this would come like before writing a single line of code. So our approach is we eliminate that entire layer of complexity, much like how like perhaps Stripe did for payments, or even how Bridge.xyz is trailblazing a similar approach with stablecoins. And that's sort of like our bread and butter. So if I had to like highlight what teams say that excites them about Sindri and how that's going to interrelate with how Midnight engineers and developers will be building with Sindri, there's a handful of things. On one hand, we make things incredibly easy and incredibly easy to integrate, just given our API approach. And it makes ZK incredibly consumable, and it can be integrated directly into applications without requiring any cryptographic expertise at all. I'd say our tooling, again, getting sort of to the core of what makes Midnight so strong, our tooling very much tries to mirror a typical Web 2 tooling set and onboarding experience. So we have SDKs and CLIs that, again, meet developers wherever they are in their developer journey, whether that's early on in development or through scalable production. Third, we turn an otherwise very slow end user UX into an incredibly fast one. We have out-of-the-box performance tuning, algorithms, performance optimizations, and that's throughout the entire life cycle. And I'd say lastly, we provide enterprise-grade scale. Like we are packaged and we ship very much like enterprise software. We are multi-cloud, and we find that our customers in particular value that entire pipeline, that entire approach as we go to market. So if you haven't, you should absolutely come and give us a try.
A lot to unpack there, and super interesting because I think what you're describing is valuable and interesting to developers at every stage, right? From people who just want to tinker with ZK but don't want to have to handle the DevOps side of things, people who are maybe experienced app developers but want simpler frameworks to build on top of something they're already doing, and then also for, as you said, enterprises, large organizations who are used to working with API and more integratable frameworks into probably what is a stack that they're trying to simplify as much as possible. I think a big challenge with a lot of blockchain adoption so far is that it hasn't met the complexity burden of proof amongst a lot of CEOs, CTOs. This is too complicated. It's new. We don't have the developer capability for this. We're not training in new languages. Web3 developers are expensive, et cetera, et cetera. And now we're creating a whole new domain of those particular concerns around ZK as well. Because said whether we like it or not, ZK is slightly different than traditional linear programming, that's slightly different than traditional smart contract development. And so we're trying to make that easier. And so thank you for explaining that out loud. We've talked a little bit about the developer experience, but you also mentioned there about the user experience. Could you share your experience on how building ZK into decentralized apps can actually benefit or provide a better user experience for some of the teams that are building with Sindri?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. There's also a lot to unpack there, but fundamentally, at least how we look at it at Sindri, is ZK changes how we think about data, right? So it opens up otherwise siloed information and it turns it into these like very hyper portable, shareable, verifiable packets that can be securely shared across platforms, across blockchains, essentially across like any digital environment. And this is extensively what makes ZK so transformative at the core, right? Like every sector in the world today relies on digital data, and ZK unlocks new ways to interact with that. So it's important to note like how pervasive this technology is as we think about like how that impacts user experience. But if we think of some of the core factors that keep enterprises sidelined from adopting blockchain at scale, it's because of a lot of those things that you mentioned, right? Like the very things that that the champions of blockchains have come to embrace and love just don't fit into that enterprise model. So like openness, transparency, like that's not what these teams want. And I recall talking to leadership at like this very large financial institution. We said, do you know what would happen if like all of a sudden everyone knew our wallet addresses and just began spamming it with NFTs? Like it would be a total nightmare. So at worst, like these permissioned blockchains is their preferred path, but at best we can meet somewhere in the middle, right? Where configurability and protections can coexist with like this global ledger technology. And I think that that's where like the user experience in ZK comes in like so elegantly. Maybe like a very concrete example of like how ZK sort of lifts the user experience as well as like increases functionality is like on Midnight, right? When a developer is building like a privacy preserving DeFi application, they can write their trading logic in TypeScript and they can leverage Midnight's framework to handle selective disclosure. And they can let Sindri's infrastructure manage the ZK proof pipeline, right? They don't have to think about like the intricacies like curve selection, proof system optimization, cutting down development time. And nonetheless, they're able to interface with a seemingly public blockchain environment without necessarily having to give away data that's sensitive to them. And that is in and of itself is a brand new paradigm. I think opens the design space and the solution space for a lot of new enterprise use cases. And that's what gets me and Sindri very excited as it relates to enterprise user experience and just opening up the solution space for how do we connect different portions and partitions of data.
Super important, super powerful, and a really nice explanation of how that plays out. As I said, we've just about got through the early adoption of enterprise blockchain. There are people who are risk accepting the transparency of the way that public blockchains work today, and that's okay. And in many cases, that's desired. That's a feature, not a bug. But for the rest, as we're moving towards wider adoption of decentralized technologies and being able to use open source infrastructure, being able to use always on 24/7 applications, automation from smart contracts, these are features that since 2015, 16, 17, the early days of Ethereum, CTOs, app developers were looking at saying, that's hugely powerful. That saves us on infrastructure. That allows us to innovate. That allows us to triple, quadruple the size of the community we can have building with us. But we don't want to do that completely in public. So all of that nascent demand that understood the power and the benefit of using blockchain infrastructure is sort of sitting on the sidelines, and it feels like we're about to unlock that, which I think is super powerful. What I'd love to do now is get to the part of the show that everybody loves. It's the demos. So Stasia, what I'd love us to do is walk through an example of how to spin up some infrastructure on Sindri, talk us through an example and help people understand with a visual walkthrough, how does it work in practice?
So just for starters, re-emphasizing a little bit of what we talked about earlier is Sindri has deliberately made our API like super low level and generalized, allowing for teams to build ZK infrastructure right into their applications across like a myriad of use cases, right? It's not use case specific. And so as a result, like much of the way that you'll interface with Sindri is going to be through our command line or through our SDKs. But we also provide a really powerful front-end user experience as well that allows users to manage account preferences, explore projects, and we'll sort of get to that. But the TLDR here is if you've interfaced with Stripe before, then you'll likely experience similar integration patterns here on Sindri. So let's just jump into it. To begin with, we're just going to create a directory that we'll call demo Midnight, and get into that directory. Oops. Perfect. And so here we'll house our circuit program artifacts, which we'll get into in just a minute. But first today, as you described, we're going to be using the Sindri CLI to generate our first proof. So the first thing we need to do is npm install the Sindri CLI. And so what's happening here is it's installing a bunch of dependencies that are required to interface just natively with the Sindri platform. So we'll just give that one moment. So as a side note, as I go through this, a lot of this will mirror what's on our documentation page if you want it to follow along at any point in time, and you can see that off of our homepage. But after we have our CLI installed, we'll actually initialize the client. So I've already signed up for a Sindri account on sindri.app. If you haven't, you can do so at sindri.app/signup. So what I'm going to do is through the CLI, I will log in to my API, and I'll also be generating an API key as well. So enter my credentials, choose a new API, and then selecting an organization is a team management feature for those institutions that have a lot of seats that are required to coordinate their engineering work. And we can touch on that at another time, but we're going to create our Sindri demo team here as well. Perfect. So now we should be all set up to use Sindri. So out of the box, we provide users with a lot of starter templates. And this includes a lot of lightweight configuration files. It includes a lot of manifests. And all of these things are needed to interact with our API. And we can call those just by simply initializing a project or a new project on Sindri. And the way that we do that is by calling Sindri init. So we can name what our circuit or project will be called. In this case, we'll just keep it simple with demo Midnight. And at this point, we will choose a proving framework. Now, from the perspective of a Midnight engineer, as Sindri and Midnight are more closely integrated, you would have the option at this stage to choose the Midnight backend. For this demo, just to give you guys the feel of the ergonomics, we'll just select CirCom. It's a pretty widely used framework. It's pretty simple. And for the sake of time and speed, we're just going to use that as the option here. So we'll go through another bit of questions around backend and other configuration. And we can also initialize our Git repository. Perfect. So now that we've got our project initialized, we are pretty ready to go. You'll see that upon initialization, we've actually populated our directory with a bunch of different helper files, manifests, and things that help us interface with the Sindri API client. So we can just look through a few of those. So most importantly, we have our circuit. This circuit is very generic. Essentially, we're just proving the equality of two different variables. We can also look at the inputs of that circuit. This input will be uploaded along with our circuit project. And then lastly, we can look at the Sindri.json. This is effectively a manifest where you will house all of your configurations related to your project. And this helps, again, drive compatibility at the point in time where we are going to deploy our project onto Sindri. So perfect. So we've got our project initialized. We are at a point where we can upload this and start to generate proofs against it. So in order to deploy our project, it's pretty simple. We'll just call on Sindri deploy. And so while that's working, we can switch over to our front end. And we can, I'll just refresh it really quickly. We can see that our project is starting to compile. Now, a quick note, unless you've specified a proving key along with your upload, behind the scenes, we've actually also initiated a mock trusted setup. So of course, in production, I think you'll want to do this yourself, right? So, but the beauty of Sindri is that you can build and get going incredibly fast using mock trusted setups in order to just start development. On our front end, just generally, you'll have a few options, including account settings, more importantly, generating new API keys for different projects. But we also have some very interesting project-specific information as well. So here's the project that we just uploaded, demo Midnight, and we can view the README. We can also look at previous versioning and also previous builds. There's some handy tooling around downloading a verification key, also downloading a smart contract verifier. Again, in a Midnight use case, these things will be tailored to your development environment in a way that makes it easier to interface with the Midnight network. And interestingly enough, we also have the ability to make your project public or private. Now, why would you want to make your project public? In that way, essentially, you get access to the Sindri Explore page, which essentially promotes your project to a bunch of different developers that may want to incorporate that as a utility feature in their own builds as well. Perfect. So now that we can see that our project has completed, we can switch back to our CLI. And in order to generate a proof, it's pretty simple. We will just insert Sindri proof create. And what this will do is grab the input file that we identified a little bit earlier. and it will run the proof through our API against that project and return that proof to you. So it looks like the proof has been done, and we have confirmation within our terminal. But at the same time, if we come back to our front end, we can also see that we've got logging of proof history across different projects that's in the front end as well. Now, this includes other metadata like public outputs, the proof itself, proof generation times, etc. But that is pretty much the entire workflow of how easy it is and how quickly it is to generate a proof on Sindri. So one last thing is I won't go into detail on is our backend infrastructure. So not to go into too much detail, but what I will say is that while this seems like super streamlined and simple, the backend is doing a ton of things like auto scaling, and that's in order to meet peak and baseline volume thresholds. It also incorporates proprietary acceleration and performance optimization. That's going to keep your end-to-end time incredibly low. So it's doing a lot of the orchestration and automation in order to make this a very robust integration into your application. So I think with that, happy to double click on anything that we went over, but that's how quickly and easy it is to get set up and use the Sindri CLI.
Set up in minutes, super easy, super intuitive. Thank you so much for taking us through it. And again, the important part there is it's not just about the configuration of the proofs and being able to put the project all together. There's also performance and acceleration under the hood, which if you're looking at generating client-side proofs versus or regular proofs, high volume and so forth, having additional acceleration may be important to the use case that you're focused on, and that's another benefit from working with Sindri. So important to clarify that one at the end, even though we didn't show it.
Exactly. That's a great point. And I think that should definitely go into sort of the optionality features of how you do intend to build on Midnight. Is there are going to be use cases where you will want to do these proof generated client side. And at the same time, as you mentioned, if you need to scale to tens of thousands of proofs and you're okay with passing along those inputs to a provider like Sindri, we are natively integrated and will be an easy integration for you.
Absolutely. We're aware that zero knowledge and privacy and data protection and the requirements is going to be a very broad spectrum across a number of different use cases. In some cases, there'll be a requirement legally, regulatorily that the proofs have to be generated client side. In other cases, performance or non-functional requirements are going to become a big part of how we construct the system. And that's where Sindri comes to play also. So really, really helpful introduction. Thank you so much for taking us through. As we wrap up the discussion, I think it's fair to say that both of our teams are betting on zero knowledge proofs and decentralized data protection being a big part of the 2025 journey for Web3 and for the general transformation of a bunch of different industries. What are the couple of maybe big ZK opportunities that you'd like to see realized in the next few months?
Yeah, again, sort of going back to the foundation of how we look at ZK, at the core, we're just able to connect the world systems and allow all of those systems to connect to the world around it in like a very verifiable way, right? So that in and of itself is groundbreaking, and it introduces these unimaginable dimensions to how we consider building systems today, which primarily remain like very, very isolated or perhaps like overly permissioned. So the degree to which you can unlock cross-domain data is one field where we are incredibly excited. And again, by remaining sort of generalized, we feel like we are very well suited to tackle that opportunity. Selfishly, I think I'd like to see ZK work itself more firmly into sort of the purview of stablecoins. I think generally speaking, stablecoins add a tremendous amount of efficiency to existing payment rails and just the overall like global movement of capital. But to like really grease those tires even further requires some level of like automation of things like releasing funds or secure party attestations to like really make it feel more like programmable money. And to a degree, ZK enables this utility at global scale. So I'd love to see ZK work its way into, again, sort of driving even more efficiency out of digital payment rails than it has today. And lastly, I think one of the more exciting opportunities that we're seeing is sort of this convergence of ZK and AI. And I think that the ability to intake large amounts of information and allow these autonomous AI agents to interface with one another is a really exciting frontier as well. And that too will require verifiability too. So I think Midnight sort of sits at the epicenter of making a lot of these things work, especially when you consider sort of the enterprise framing behind it and what's important to them. So really excited about the future, really excited about sort of what we at Sindri and you guys at Midnight are able to accomplish across these three different surface areas.
I'm with you. Stablecoins and AI, it doesn't get much bigger than those two if you look at the landscape today. So 100%, I'm with you on both of those and want to see a lot more work done in that space over the months to come. That wraps up our inspiring discussion with Stasia Carson from Sindri. We've covered the experience of building dApps with ZK, the Sindri developer experience and the toolkit, and of course, another fantastic demo. If you've enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe, rate, and leave a review on your favorite podcast platform. And don't forget to follow us on social media for the latest updates and more exciting conversations in the world of blockchain and data protection. Unshielded is brought to you by Midnight. To find out more about how the Midnight Network is helping everyone to build a more equitable and accessible internet, visit our website at midnight.network. And remember to search Unshielded on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, and be sure to subscribe so you'll never miss an episode.